Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 24, The Aurora UFO. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Thank you all for coming back as we have now finished up our October Spooktacular, and that seems like an eternity ago. We are back to our regularly scheduled show. I'm excited to get back into a UFO story, and honestly, it's been a little bit of a hiatus. We didn't really expect to be gone as long as we were. We had quite a bit of stuff going on with family. I had a baby. My office no longer exists, so we've been kind of trying to get back into the groove. It's taken us a little bit longer, but now that we've had our hiatus, we're ready to get back into it. And we're kind of like late December now. We're getting back into UFO stories. And what better time, though? Because have you heard of the drones flying over Jersey right now and over the Northeast?
Man, I have been seeing this in the news about these drones. My father-in-law this weekend was asking me about it. Like he was trying to get my opinion on everything. I'm like, I didn't know about it until he started talking about it.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like you guys got this podcast where you're talking about UFOs. What do you think about these drones flying over the Northeast? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, it was reminiscent. It reminded me of UFOs over Washington, that episode that we did a while back. I even tweeted that. I was thinking, man, it's great timing because I had written part of this episode already, and that kind of spurred me. I'm like, I got to get back into it. I got to get back in the saddle. I'm currently recording in my bedroom, which is a really weird space. I have like a card table set up and some foam pads and stuff around me. But once my office is done, I'll be able to record in my own space again. But as of right now, we have a full episode for you tonight. We're going to go through the Aurora Texas UFO incident. But I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a welcome back, I guess, intro here. So all that said, Jason, are you ready?
Man, I am so ready. I've been excited for the last month to do this. Obviously, like Paul said, he's had a kid in the last month. So I guess I could have probably come up with a story myself, but my life's been a little bit busy on the side as well. So I am very, very happy to be back in it and ready to hear a story.
Awesome. Okay, well, here we go. Early in the morning on April 19th, 1897, the small town of Aurora, Texas was quiet, when suddenly a light streaked across the sky. A man in his home heard a thunderous boom. His windmill outside was crumpled, and near it a pile of something metallic lay smoking on the ground. A metal tube, like nothing he had ever seen before. While standing there, out crawled a creature, a 4-foot-tall humanoid being.
So they've never seen a plane before. You see this metal thing that, seeing metal things fly across the sky is crazy to begin with. But then not only is a metal thing flying across the sky, you now cannot ignore that. You can't ignore that as a meteor because now you see a 4-foot tall humanoid creature walking out of that metal cylinder. Now you gotta understand this is actual ship.
Yeah, it's very strange. They did have airships, like blimps and things. And I know it's actually really weird timing because I was at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio this morning. And one of the things in the early flight timeline or whatever they have there, they had some like early balloons and blimp things leading up to the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, right? And they did have airships. And so a lot of times when the story is like when you look back at the original stuff, the original text, what you see is they refer to it as an airship because that's all they really know at that time. They didn't have heavier than air mechanical travel at that point. Everything was like balloons and blimps and things up until 1903, of course.
So this is a scary thing just to start out with,
Yes. It's a very weird thing to have happen.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I think my first instinct would be to shoot. Shoot and ask questions later.
Not a great instinct, but you do. We'll get into it here in a little bit, but that does seem to happen. But yeah, this is a really interesting one. And, the game plan for tonight is we're going to do a brief overview of Aurora, Texas. Not Aurora, Colorado. I always hear Aurora and I think of Colorado, but this is Texas. It's right outside Dallas. So we'll talk about that. We're going to go into a timeline of the event. There's two different kind of like main stories, and then we're going to cover the investigation. We'll talk about theories, and finally, we'll close up with our own thoughts. So, Aurora, Texas at this time was pretty small, and it's still pretty small today, but at the time it had 1,700 people. Think about like an old west, an old timey town. You'll conjure up images of like small, dusty towns, farmhouses, nothing really around them, guys with cowboy hats and guns. And that's what I picture for this town. And I think that's what this town looked like at this time. So, Aurora, Texas is a small town, but it's situated right outside of Dallas, Fort Worth, which obviously those are huge cities. Dallas in 1900 only had a population of about 40,000 people. Kind of put that in perspective for you. New York at the time had about 7 million, and to get a little closer to home, Cincinnati had about 300,000 people.
Wow, so not very many people at all. I bet a lot of people probably knew each other in this little city.
Yeah, and Aurora is so small they knew each other. And Dallas at the time, I mean, 40,000 people, they probably all knew each other as well. And then, of course, now Dallas Fort Worth, the greater area, is about 8 million people. So it's obviously grown quite a bit since then. But Aurora, Texas hasn't really grown as much. I think it's still below 2,000 people in that town.
Dang.
So this UFO encounter has become kind of like a legend. It's like a town legend at this point. It's kind of grown more than what it was or what it is. We're not really sure. We'll get into it here in a little bit. But it's one of those things where like a small town had an incident that happened. They're famous for it. And the story kind of took its own legs and kind of did its own thing. And so this happened a long time ago. And you know, when that happens, when you have something that happened so long ago, stories really grow. And so you got to try to figure out how can you pin down what exactly happened. And I found a lot of different things that identified it. And what's really nice is there is a text that I found from the 70s that was an investigation that was done by MUFON. It's a real long article, which is really nice to have, that kind of consolidates a lot of this information. We'll get to that here a little bit later. But what we know is that prior to this crash, people in this area had been seeing what they called airships flying overhead. The classic cigar-shaped objects, they had been spotted all throughout the previous year leading up to this event.
So I don't mean to interrupt you in the middle of this, but this is what I love about listening to your stories is I can totally bypass having to do research here and just listen to you talk. And for the most part, if I really doubted something you said, I could just look it up because you sit here and have all the stuff in the story notes.
My issue, that's actually my problem, and that's why it takes me so long to write these, is that like I'll start doing the research and I don't take a lot of things at face value. And so I'm like, I want to pinpoint what happened before. I want to read it from a different perspective. And there's just a lot. And so it's hard to really, I mean, and the internet today is very annoying. I'm not sure if you ever sort of Google anything lately, but it's impossible to pin anything down until you can find something like an actual PDF or a book or something where things have been consolidated. And so it's nice to have those. But with that, you do have conflicting information. And what I found with this episode, like many episodes we've done before, there are conflicting things here. And that just kind of is what it is. But we'll kind of go through all that as we go along. So they describe these objects as airships, and one artist's rendition, it looks exactly like what you would expect a blimp, a futuristic blimp to look like at the time, like a basket hanging below it. And my guess is that they just had no concept of what a spaceship actually would look like. And the description given later, however, seems to resemble what like many UFO encounters have now, that metal tube cigar shaped object that was described and that has been described. And of course, now we've had so many UFO incidents, and that's kind of like the end all be all, a cigar shaped object in the sky. At the time, of course, all they had for reference were blimps or balloons. And so that's how they kind of rendered it, and that's how they talked about it.
So you kind of got to wonder if maybe either one, there is two types of aliens. Ones that fly these like typical cigar shaped looking spaceships, or these saucer type of spaceships. Like either one, aliens have evolved and have made better spaceships, or two, there's two different races here.
Yeah, I imagine my thought is if there are truly extraterrestrial life, if there's life outside of Earth, and they have the ability to travel to Earth, and they are actively traveling to Earth, I imagine there's more than one civilization doing that. So I think it's like all or nothing in my mind. Either they don't exist, it's our own stuff. We'll never get to that point. We're too early or too far apart, whatever, however you want to say it. Physics doesn't allow it, whatever. But if extraterrestrial life does exist and they do travel to Earth, if that's the case, you have to assume that there's multiple civilizations at varying levels of technological advancements, and they're coming and visiting or looking over Earth or whatever. It's either all or nothing in my mind, I think, because like, yeah, you do have the common saucer, cigar shaped objects, the different things in the sky. We did talk about this in the other Texas episode that we did. I don't remember what episode that was now, but if you think about a cigar shaped object, yeah, in the sky, if you take a plate and you hold it sideways, or if you you hold a frisbee, it's going to look like a cigar. But if you turn it, it's going to look like a circle. It's going to look like a saucer. So that's also part of it, right? Was that maybe you could even say that saucers on their side, when you look at them two dimensionally, you're going to only see what looks like a cigar, but you turn it and then you get the depth and the dimension. You actually see that as a circle. That's also a possibility as well.
So what you're saying is like it's probably the same spaceship. It's just the way they're looking at it.
Yeah, it's either the same vehicles that are flying around, very similar shaped vehicles, or it's multiple civilizations coming and just visiting. One is visiting, they're farmers, they're farming us. They're getting ready for a harvest here soon. They're checking on their cattle.
They're like, we need to make these guys fatter. Let's introduce them to GMOs.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start by reading a newspaper clipping from Dallas Morning News by S.E. Hayden. And this is from auroratexas.gov. And again, it'll be in the show notes, but I want to start here because this is kind of the earliest rendition of this story. Quote, about 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing around the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer the earth than before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour, and gradually settling towards Earth. It sailed over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, it collided with Judge Proctors' windmill and went into pieces with a terrific explosion. End quote.
Oh, wow. So this has been seen across the country already.
Yeah, so leading up to this incident, supposedly there were sightings of things in the sky, lights, things traveling for the entire year. It was kind of like, the 1952 UFO flap that ended in UFOs over Washington, like we talked about earlier. That is kind of similar to this, where the entire previous year they've been seeing weird things in the sky, lights, whatever you want to call them, aircraft, airships, whatever. And supposedly S.E. Hayden, he's referencing those prior interactions or those prior incidences with the culmination of this final incident where a vehicle ends up actually crashing.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of the original story legend comes from this first article, and we'll get back to like theories about why that is. But the story does deviate from here a little. So there is the story that was written in the Dallas Morning News, which basically says this thing crashed. Judge Proctor, as well as the townspeople, they approach the craft, and in this small craft, there's a small, badly mangled humanoid creature. It was about 4 feet tall and apparently dead from the crash. The only real description given was that it was clear it wasn't from this world. And so the townspeople then they go take the body. They end up burying it in the cemetery. They give it a full Christian burial. They take the metal scraps from the craft and they drop it down a well. And then the rest of the scraps, some of the smaller stuff gets buried with the creature. Some speculate that it was part of his actual suit, flight suit or whatever. But the story in the Dallas Morning News is that very succinct little story where this thing crashed. There was a humanoid body in it. The townspeople took the body, or full Christian burial, and then they went and they disposed of the stuff. And kind of that's the legend. And then from there we have iterations of that same story throughout the years and legends leading up to now, basically.
See, we're good humans. We take care of them. We don't just kill everything that drops on Earth. We bury it too, and give it a Christian burial.
Yeah.
I mean, I might have shot it, double tapped it.
Yeah, made sure it was dead. Yeah, that's terrible.
All right, it's dead. We're good.
Yeah.
Let's bury it.
I'm not affiliated with you. If any aliens are listening to this podcast, I don't. I'm not affiliated with this guy.
If you don't hear from him tomorrow, we'll know why.
Yeah, you can end up being abducted and probed. Okay, so you could say, okay, well, that was an interesting story, town legend, whatever you want to call it. It's pretty succinct, pretty easy. However, that's not the whole story. I did find a book called Aurora Texas 1897 UFO Crash: The Real Story by Stan Hayden. Interestingly enough, same last name as S.E. Hayden, who wrote the original story. So Hayden, he claims this book is a description of an oral history that has been passed down for 5 generations. The book itself is labeled as fiction, but Hayden, in his own description, states that his father would be upset that it was not labeled as nonfiction, as this version of the story from his father's perspective and onward is that this is the true version of what happened. And it's been passed down through generations. He finally writes it down. He can't really verify it, so he labels it fiction. But from his perspective, his father and his father before him had been telling the story for generations. And it's the true, real story of what happened in 1897 in Aurora, Texas. So, similar to the previous story, the ship crashes into the windmill on Judge Proctor's property. And so in Hayden's variation, Proctor is sitting at home and he hears this boom. He thinks, well, I've got a lot of enemies. I'm a judge. Someone must have snuck onto my property and planted dynamite at the base of my windmill. So he runs out, he grabs his gun, he goes outside, and what he sees is like smoke and crash. So he approaches the crash site, and what he sees is like this metal silver tube about 12 feet long, 5 feet diameter. It has windows on it. He describes it as having a rounded top and 3 triangle-like fins at the base. And it's pretty mangled, but he's able to identify those features. So this thing is like bellowing smoke, which draws the attention of the sheriff and the townspeople. So while he's investigating, people are like, what is going on? They're starting to head towards the crash site. They see this thing kind of fly through the sky and crash. So the door pops open on the craft, and out crawls this 4-foot gray creature. It's got this oversized head, giant eyes. It crawls towards them about 15 feet before it collapses. And then it gets up and it starts approaching him with his hand extended. And I just kind of I imagine in my head, it kind of looks like the alien from the movie Paul, if you've seen that. He kind of brushes himself off, sees this guy, and he's like, oh, I'm going to just put my hand out. I'm going to greet this guy. And the sheriff is spooked by this, and he pulls his gun on him. And it approaches him, and he just shoots it. So the creature is shocked by this. He like, all right, it's been shot. And he takes off running into the woods. So it runs into this girl. She panics. She screams, and she takes off. And the alien's kind of like frantic, and it runs off into the woods.
Yeah, so if Paul, the alien, comes up and like puts his hand out to me like he's gonna greet me, I wouldn't go and shoot him right off the bat. He's only 4 foot tall. I feel like you should give the guy a break.
You said earlier you would start blasting.
Well, I mean, I don't know. At first, like maybe, but like he put his hand out like he's gonna greet him. That's a little different. That's not an attack.
Well, I don't know if he put his hand out. I don't know if he put it out like he was going to greet him, but he put his hand out. For me, I don't think I would. I mean, in that situation, if all the things that I know, if I were to run into some alien creature that had just crashed a vehicle, I don't think that I would shoot it, because the fact that it made it to Earth, you would assume that I don't know. That sounds risky to me. I think what you do is you try to befriend it, try to be really nice to it, so that when the aliens do show up to like invade and take over, they're like, oh, we got a friend. His name is Paul. We're going to take him with us. We're going to take care of him. We're not going to wipe him out. You know what I mean?
We're gonna kill everybody else, but save Paul.
I'm gonna befriend him. I'm gonna be nice to him. Give him chocolate. Give him my coat, a blanket, whatever. He's cold. Give him the shoes off my feet. That's what's gonna happen.
They're like, Paul can live, and then Paul's gonna be the last human alive.
I'll be in some kind of like alien zoo. That's fine. I'll take it. Okay. So the Sheriff Thompson, he shows up, and the judge tells him this whole story. and they basically decide they need to hunt this thing down and they need to kill it. A very 1897 thing to think. So the judge, he'd already sent his ranch hands out. They were chasing this thing down. The judge and the sheriff and the other guy named Rosen, so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Rosen, his sister was the one that saw the alien spooked and screamed and all that stuff, and he came kind of running over to Judge Proctor's property. So he's also there, this guy named Rosen. So they get horses, they get ready, and they get their rifles and stuff, and they take off, and they're going to catch this. They're going to catch this creature. So they end up catching up to the ranch hands that are already chasing the alien. And when they get up to him, the guys are like coming back, and one of them is like badly injured, and they're just carrying him back. They have this little like quick exchange about how the creature is not of this world, it's not natural, yada yada. But they push on and they continue to hunt. And so once the ranch hands like drop the guy off that was injured, they come back, they meet up, they basically make like a hunting party, and they lead him off into this clearing. In the middle of this clearing, the creature is just lying there. He's gurgling, struggling for breath. He's been shot. So they're standing over it. It's dying from this gunshot wound. And at this point, they're starting to kind of feel bad. Like, oh, we just chased this thing down. It seems intelligent. It's dying. It's like they feel bad. And so the sheriff bends down next to it. He's like trying to talk to it. They're kind of feeling guilty. It's clearly sentient. And so they're doing their thing. And all of a sudden, the judge just pulls out his gun and shoots it in the head. Like, after all this, they're feeling bad. They're trying to talk to it. And then he just, like, blasts it. There's, like, this exchange between the judge and the sheriff. And the sheriff's, like, clearly annoyed. He's like, why'd you shoot him? Like, what the heck? Like, we were trying to talk to him. He's clearly dying. And the judge is like, well, we had to kill this thing. We can't let it live. It's dangerous. And I don't know how long it took for them to kind of come to that conclusion. But the sheriff's like, yeah, you're probably right. And then they're like, we got to cover this up. We can't let the townspeople know about this. They'll freak out. So they wrap this creature in like a bedroll, and they get the town undertaker, who then helps them put the body in a casket. And they end up, digging a hole next to this oak tree, and they bury the casket. So they take the dynamite, they blow up the ship, take the pieces, they put it down the well, which is kind of like the same thing that was written in the Dallas paper. They are like, all right, we're done. We're covering this thing up. So the townspeople the next day are like, oh, somebody got buried in the cemetery, and they don't really know who it is, but if someone's going to get buried, we're going to give them a Christian funeral. They deserve a Christian funeral for their soul. And so they do that. So the townspeople gather, they do a full Christian funeral. You got Rosen, Judge Proctor, the sheriff, they're all standing around they're like, we know what happened. We know what's going on. But the townspeople they think just like a drifter or somebody had died and got buried there.
So when you think about it, it kind of makes, well, it doesn't make sense to just like kill him outright. But like during this year, like it was not, everybody was scared of everything because, the way of life was a delicate thing.
Yeah, it was wild. It was the Wild West at this point.
Yeah. So, I mean, if something was remotely dangerous to society, they didn't think twice about putting it down.
Yeah. They weren't screwing around with this. They were done.
Especially if it's not of this world. I mean, they don't want to find out what it can do. But that said, in the same breath, if it's innocent and looks like it's not trying to harm you, it's kind of silly to just put it down.
Yeah, we're looking at it through the lens of 2024, which is a very different lens than 1897. But yeah, you feel kind of like, well, you feel bad for it. And of course, again, through their lens, they're seeing this creature, this alien creature that they don't know what it is. Maybe they think it's a demon, maybe whatever they think, superstitions, whatever they think. Of course, in our mindset, we have a lot of like pop culture and different things that have kind of changed how we look at things and maybe how we would feel about this. And so, they didn't even have flying craft yet. They didn't have like actual planes or anything. And so this is just a very different world that they're living in. And yeah, you feel bad because the alien probably was like, that'd be like us. That'd be like us going to an uncontacted tribe somewhere. And we like pull our phone out and it has lights and stuff on it. And they spear us to death. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that same thing where like the worlds don't really match up. And we're getting closer maybe to that mindset. Like if we interact, if somehow aliens came today and said, hey, we exist, well, I think we would be better at that contact than they would have been in 1897. more prepared for that contact, I guess.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So that's our story. That's really all that we have. We have the abbreviated version that was written in the Dallas paper, and then we have this longer version that was written as a passed down, like an oral history. And so you think, the story ends there, but there's actually a full on investigation that we're going to talk about that happened in the 70s, years later. But before we get into that, I do want to add a quick story from the 1940s that will tie into our later investigations. So we talked about the debris being dumped into the well on Judge Proctor's land. Well, once the debris was dumped there, they closed the well, they were done using it. And so years later, again in the 1940s, Proctor's land was purchased by a man named Brawley Oates. So one of the first things he does is unseal the well, and he removes all this debris. He's going to use the well. And so supposedly Oates suffered some severe health problems, specifically arthritis. And you kind of picture an old lady with her hands don't really work as well anymore. It's not like regular arthritis. This guy had severe hand mangling, debilitating arthritis, which he attributed to the contaminated well, the stuff that he dug out of the well. I don't even know if he had enough time to actually use it. It was very quick, and all this arthritis and stuff, and his hands all messed up, came very quickly after him pulling all this stuff out of the well, and he seals it off permanently. And so if you watch, there's an Ancient Aliens episode on this, and if you watch that, they show a picture of this guy and his hands, and they're gnarly looking, they're messed up. And they claim that he eventually died from complications from arthritis, which is wild, because I guess if you think about the contamination, the radiation, or whatever it was, it made his hands so bad, the arthritis was so bad, that he died from complications of it. It's pretty crazy if you think about it. But supposedly, kind of in between this time of this crash happening and this investigation we're about to get into, in the 1940s, this guy bought the land, messed around with contaminated metal, and he had really severe arthritis.
That's kind of crazy that he died from arthritis. I wonder if it was rheumatoid or something.
Yeah, I don't know. It said complications from arthritis.
Yeah, I know some arthritis can affect your heart, so I wonder if maybe that's what it was.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think that, this contamination essentially led to this guy's death and basically debilitating arthritis. And besides that, besides Brawley Oates' medical problems, there's not much that happens in the immediate aftermath of the story. It's kind of the story, there's this little blip of this guy, Brawley Oates, who ends up getting arthritis and dies. And then you kind of fast forward all the way to the 1970s. And so up until that point, it's basically just a legend that's existed in this town for about 70 years or so. So this is when things really get interesting and it becomes a national story. We're going to talk about two journalists here for a moment and what they do here in Aurora that expands this story further. So it's almost like a second legend. There's two legends. It's the original story, and then you have this story that's lumped in as the full story. So there's this man by the name of Bill Case. He's an aviation writer for the Dallas Times-Herald. He hears about this legend and he decides he's going to investigate it himself. So he arrives in town and he starts asking the locals about this story. So he talks to this guy, G.C. Curley, who's about 98 at the time of the interview. And he basically just tells him, yeah, I was there. I remember the incident. I saw the body. I saw the debris. It's all real. And he's buried in a town cemetery. And so he ends up talking to some other people. He speaks to a woman by the name of Mary Evans. And so Mary Evans was 15 at the time of the UFO crash. And her parents, they were eyewitnesses to the crash site itself. They actually saw the creature. And they reportedly told their daughter that they saw the debris as well as a small man that was in the airship that was torn up from the crash. So Case, he gets his metal detector and he goes to where the grave has been described to him. There's this little headstone with a little cigar-shaped object hand engraved into it. It's marking a small child-sized grave. He uses the metal detector and he gets a hit on the metal. There's metal down in the ground at the gravesite with this UFO inscribed headstone. And so one other quick note here I want to make before we talk about the other journalists. Bill Case was he was the state director of MUFON, or Mutual UFO Network. And some of this information we'll discuss comes directly from a MUFON file. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There is a full file on this, and that's because Bill Case was the state director of MUFON at this time.
So is MUFON like a government agency?
No, it's like an independent entity that is well known at this time. It's not government. It's not Blue Book. It's not part of that. MUFON's its own like standalone thing. But whenever you talk about UFO or alien or aircraft or whatever, MUFON is kind of one of those like widely accepted institution that studies this stuff, and that's what that is. It's not tied to the government.
Interesting. Are they still around?
I don't know. That's a good question. I assume so. I imagine they are. I don't know. That's a good question though, because whenever I think of MUFON, I think of these old UFO stories from like pre-2000. I never really thought about whether they are or not. I hear your mouse clicking on your side, so I imagine you're looking it up right now.
Oh, wow. So this is pretty cool. MUFON is still around. The MUFON Journal. They were established in 1969.
Oh, there you go. They do exist.
They do exist. You can be a member too.
Oh, I might join.
It's $30 annually.
Oh, that's steep.
Oh, my bad. $60 per year.
That's even more steep. Okay, so the second journalist named Jim Mars, he comes to town. And he's there at the same time as Case. And they know each other to some extent, I guess. But Mars interviews a man named Charlie C. Stevens, who is 83 and would have been about 10 years old at the time of the UFO crash. And so Stevens, he recalls working with his father in the field when all of a sudden they look in the sky and they see this metallic cigar-shaped structure flying low overhead towards Aurora. And then all of a sudden they see and they hear this explosion from the direction where the vehicle was flying in Aurora, Texas. And so Stevens recalls telling his dad that he wanted to go investigate, but they had all this work to do still, they had chores and stuff, and his dad's like, no, you can't go. And so the next day his dad goes into town and he comes back with news that he saw the craft and the debris, and he confirms that it was something not from this world. So both Mars and Case that are in town doing this research here in 1973, they both have these firsthand interviews confirming this crash had taken place. Mars also goes to the cemetery. He sees the marker with UFO engraved on it and the small grave. He sees all that, the same stuff that Bill Case had seen. And so we talked about how Case, he metal detected the cemetery and he got hits where the small marker was. Well, there was some attempt, I guess, at getting permission to exhume the remains from the grave. And so while they were seeking the legal process, they were trying to get like this legal hold or whatever lifted so they could like dig this grave up. During this time, the headstone goes missing and the metal that was previously detected goes missing as well. In its place are 3 small holes that are believed to be from some tube type device that dug straight down and retrieved the metal. And they were also denied permission to exhume the grave. So basically, not only did they not get permission to exhume the grave, somebody in town lifted the headstone and removed the metal from the grave, and basically the trace of this grave is gone.
So basically what you're saying is we have aliens hiding among us who like to hide evidence of themselves.
That, or the town was like, hey, we got some outsiders here. We're not going to let them mess with our stuff. And they hid it. Or the U.S. government was like, hey, we need to go and pull this metal out of here. It's, futuristic metal, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I mean, he gave the last guy arthritis that killed him, so it kind of makes sense to try to get rid of it.
Yeah, true. So from here, what I want to do is I want to talk about the MUFON investigation. So as stated before, MUFON is the Mutual UFO Network. And the file that I worked from is titled Metal from Crashed UFO by John F. Schuessler. I'll have the source in the show notes. It's on a website called cdn.preterhuman.net. It's about 200 pages long. It's going to be accessible in our show notes. It is a MUFON document by John F. Schuessler. So investigators go to the site where the crash was claimed to have taken place, and they metal detect the area, and they get multiple hits. They dig down, and they find metal. And they believe it's from the 1897 UFO crash. It's right outside of where it was described happened. And they believe they found like this metal from this explosion. And so what I want to do is I'll quote the file by Schuessler here quickly regarding the discovery of this metal. Quote, the sample was retrieved from a location about 100 feet west of the well site, beneath 4 inches of soil. It was lodged directly against the face of the limestone rock and conformed to the exact configuration of the stone. indicating it was in a near molten state when it penetrated the earth and it hit the rock where it cooled. End quote.
Wow. So I mean, this is evidence in itself that it was a flying ship at one point in time. I mean, for it to get that hot to where it is like molding with the rock. I mean, that is. I feel like that's a lot of evidence right there in itself.
Yeah, they have evidence that there is some type of. I mean, this metal was heated to such a hot temperature that it melted, became liquid against this rock, against this limestone. Yeah, it's really interesting because you're like, okay, if that really exists, if there really is metal like shrapnel from an explosion that was superheated and then cooled, I mean, what explodes and causes that kind of temperature change? The other thing that's really interesting is they run some tests on it. And so they have like an X-ray fluorescence analysis, an X-ray spectrographic analysis, and they also do like a photomicrographs of the metal. And what they find is that it's highly purified aluminum with traces of iron, no copper, and no zinc, which is said to be significant, I guess, because copper should be present if it were to be. Like, I guess if it's man-made at this time, you would assume there is copper contamination or copper in the metal, but there is none. It's like a pure aluminum with traces of iron in it. And there's also absence of zinc, which is significant, I guess, because the materials in the well contain zinc and this one doesn't. And so it's really interesting because they find this metal that was superheated, cooled. It's purified aluminum with traces of iron, essentially, which is not indicative of metal at this time.
Wow, that is crazy. There's a lot of evidence here for this to be otherworldly. That's so cool.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. So, and this is the investigation that was taking place by Bill Case in 1973. So, additionally, the photo micrographs they show the presence of large grains, which I don't really know what that means, which indicates no stress, meaning that it went through a melting and cooling stage. So, the MUFON file heavily implies that this metal is non-terrestrial. And so the write-up includes a letter by J. Allen Hynek from Bill Case. And we talk about J. Allen Hynek, I think, in every UFO case or episode that we've had, but there is a letter to him from Bill Case. In it, he describes the metal we talked about and also that the metal is pretty much everywhere, that small pieces of metal are scattered all around the property, indicating an explosion of some kind. I guess the metal is scattered in like a explosion pattern. So their investigation is broken into like multiple phases. And so phase one focuses purely on the crash itself, claiming that with a high degree of certainty, there was a crash of some kind that took place here. There was an explosion that threw purified molten aluminum metal across the ground.
So I wonder if anybody else got sick from all this metal going everywhere. Like saying as one guy tried to dig up this metal and got arthritis really bad.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that it's really. I didn't read anywhere that they did. It's just that they collected the metal craft and just dropped it in the well and they closed the well. If this guy would say this guy bought the property and was pulling it out by hand, that would make sense because he's like maybe exposed to it over a longer period of time. Whereas like they were quick to cover it up. They dropped it all down a well and closed it up. So it's different contamination levels. But I don't think I read anywhere that there was other injury or health problems from this metal. So phase two of this investigation surrounds the pilot itself or himself. And there's not much additional information here more than what we've already discussed. And so they indicate that the headstone carving of an airship appears to be the correct age from the 1897 crash. It wasn't like newly formed. It wasn't like somebody went and like tagged a rock or like carved it recently. It was roughly 76 years old when they found it. They surmise, I guess. And they go further into discussing how the town is like highly religious and they refuse to exhume the body. And so Bill Case, he believes that there is something there, a pilot from another world, but without digging him up, there's really no way of confirming that. So phase two of this investigation is more shaky. Phase one, they're pretty certain that something exploded, something was there. Phase two, they believe that there's an alien buried there, but they can't really confirm it because they can't dig him up. So that's the investigation. That's the 1970s. That's like the second part of this legend. is we had, the story itself, and then you have like the additional information, the investigation that was done by Bill Case and MUFON. And so now what I want to do is let's jump into some theories. There's not really much here to discuss, I guess, other than like this was some sort of hoax or it was a real incident. And so I guess we can kind of break this down into three distinct theories. An alien aircraft crashed and a body was buried. Some type of explosion took place on Judge Proctor's property, and this legend took shape around the town. Lastly, this was some type of hoax, and it's just a fun town legend. So, first, let's talk about it as a hoax. So, we talked about a large, elaborate story earlier of the chase that took place, the judge shooting the being, all that stuff. So, I don't know if you call it like a hoax or more of like a legend that was just kind of like that's gotten its own legs and gotten bigger over time. But the biggest indication that this was a hoax is the 1897 article written by S.E. Hayden. So the first reports of this incident were from Hayden's article in the Dallas Morning News. The claim is that Hayden made up the story, not really like as a hoax, but as some sort of science fiction writing for the paper. Like he just was like coming up with his own story. It was short fiction that he wrote and added to the paper, and it basically became this bigger thing, kind of like H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, when he was reading it on the radio and people took it as like a real thing, kind of like that. It was like a short story. It was fiction. He wrote it in the Dallas Morning News, and people like ran with the story. In 1980, Time magazine ran an article where they interviewed Etta Pegas, an 86-year-old woman who had claimed that the UFO legend was a joke. It was intended to bring interest to the town of Aurora. Basically, there was a rail line that was passing through the town, but it went around the town, it was past the town, and the town began to die. So they came up with this like UFO legend to kind of stir up interest in the town and bring people to the town, essentially.
Well, that's kind of crazy to think because, I mean, they're describing what we have seen multiple times. And not only that, but they saw this ship fly over the country prior to even landing in Aurora, right?
Supposedly, yeah, there were sightings of craft flying around Texas at this time.
I don't know. That's a pretty far-fetched story. Pretty well made up, I guess. I mean, because we're kind of thriving off that story, if that's the case. You know, if this is one of the first alien stories to come out, we've been thriving off that story for 100 years now. Over 100 years.
Right, exactly. But so what about all the debris and the metal that was scattered across Judge Proctor's farm? Two theories. Either there was some explosion reported by the people of the town, and maybe that's like the kernel of truth that made its way to Hayden, who then wrote the UFO story. But what could make that large of an explosion? And what creates molten aluminum and iron and steel shards, all this metal that's basically purified, superheated? What kind of explosion would do that?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question too, because you said when they pulled out this metal that most of it looked like it had melted like into the rock. So I mean that's kind of pretty hard to just put off like it was nothing.
Yeah, it is kind of weird because it's like I don't know what kind of explosion would cause to like the purification of like aluminum, iron, and maybe some steel, and for it to like get so hot, superheated that it would melt and then cool against a rock 4 inches underground or whatever. I don't know though. I mean, maybe. I mean, they talk about dynamite. There was a lot of I don't know what the Old West how often they were blowing stuff up, but like maybe there was some kind of explosion that they then elaborated on, and then Hayden ran with this story that it was a UFO and then it became this bigger thing. I mean, that easily could be the case, but I don't know. That seems maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. I'm not sure. But lastly, our third theory is that it's an actual UFO crash that took place in 1897. So there were reports we talked about earlier of flying crafts over the course of the year leading up to this incident. I mean, what if one of these did fail and it crash landed at Judge Proctor's property? If there was a pilot killed in the crash, I mean, why wouldn't they bury him in town? That would be the most logical step for them, right? If they recovered a body, they would bury it. And so to go as far as to say that it was like a manhunt, like an execution, all this stuff of this alien, maybe that was tacked on later. Maybe that's kind of like a little bit more of an elaboration. But if there was a UFO that crashed and a creature did perish, I wouldn't be shocked if a small town, especially a small religious town, was like, let's just bury this guy, give him a good full Christian burial, and leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean that way they can bury it and not talk about it. I mean the judge and the sheriff were involved, so it kind of makes sense that they can just cover each other's butts.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's our three theories: that it was a hoax, that there was a real explosion that became a bigger story, or that it was actually a UFO, an actual alien encounter that crash landed at Judge Proctor's property. So at this point, let's kind of talk about what we think happened. And I'll go first. So personally, I think with all the evidence that's here, there was some sort of explosion. Something happened. There was an explosion. There just seems to be like way too much evidence to say there wasn't. I think there was some kind of explosion. There was superheated metal that formed and whatever, all the stuff we talked about, the purified aluminum and iron, all that stuff. That happened. I think that happened for sure. To go as far as to say there was like a living creature that was killed in the crash and then buried, I mean, I don't know. There's so many hoaxes and things at this point. I want to believe that. I do want to believe that there was some kind of creature that crash landed and died there. Man, I would love it if that was the case. If this is like a true first contact alien craft that crash landed, that would be amazing. And it was buried in Aurora, Texas cemetery. That would be awesome. But part of me thinks like this is one of those town legends. It's so long ago. There's not a whole lot of corroborating evidence other than this Dallas newspaper basically that just ran with this story. I think there for sure was an explosion. And I'm kind of 50-50 on it being like just a normal terrestrial, some kind of dynamite that it blew up, or that it was a real UFO. I'm kind of like in the mix. There was an explosion, but I'm not sure if it was extraterrestrial and alien or if it was some kind of like rogue dynamite that blew up some metal or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely could see this being like the real deal in a way. I mean, I'm very skeptical when it comes to aliens. It kind of makes sense that their first contact would be somebody accidentally crash landing, and they go to greet somebody and they get shot, and now they're like, well, let's not land anymore. Let's not talk to these people. We'll just stay up in space and observe them. Like we'll fly around, like watch them a little bit, but we're not landing anymore. Like we're done with that. We saw what happened to Paul. He went, stuck his hand out, asked to be greeted, and they put a bullet in him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, and then his dying words that he was trying to communicate to them and apologize, and they just shot him in the head. So I don't know. I could see it being real. I could definitely see it because it was a nice contact. They came in peace. They accidentally crashed. How it all starts. It's a possibility.
Yeah, I could see it. I want to believe, especially with drones and UFOs flying over Jersey right now. I want to believe that the first contact was 1897, Aurora, Texas.
Yep, I'll take it. I mean, obviously it could all still be a hoax. They did crazy things back in the day to try to get people to visit towns, but I think the fact that it's been seen across the country and then all of a sudden it lands here, like, that's a possibility. I don't know. I could go, I'd say 50-50 as well.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for joining us for our first episode back from our unexpectedly long break. Hope that you all enjoy this one. I mean, we had a decent absence. I hated being gone for so long. Hopefully we didn't lose all our listeners from being such a long hiatus. The plan is to be back at it. And so I hope that we can continue to do 2-week intervals. That's our normal schedule. I think we can now that kind of everything, all the dust has settled for both of us. We've had some busy stuff going on. I think we can get back into the groove. So please subscribe, follow us, listen, join, tell your friends about us, whatever you want to do. And we'll see you next time on The Anecdotalist.